Great. So we've already talked a little bit about ideals today. So the ideal for the next 35 minutes, which is perfect, we're right on time, is that this is not just a Q&A, but a discussion. So in addition to asking, of course, any questions to the panelists that you want to ask, obviously a lot of you in the room have a lot of expertise and experience in this area as well. So we'd like to leave it open also for some two-way discussion about some of the topics that have come up this morning, and more broadly, as we said, about the current initiatives, but also the future trajectory of the landscape for open scholarship. So that's the idea. And we do have two helpers, Kelly and Stuart, who have microphones. So if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please do raise your hand, and they'll bring you a microphone before. So we'll just open the floor to start off.
Thanks to all of you for your presentations. This question, I think, is most specifically for Dan. Thanks for your work at Collabra. In my work as a reviewer, I agitate actively to encourage editorial teams to move from closed journals to open access journals. If an editorial team at a closed journal were interested in moving en masse to an open access journal, could Collabra take them in as part of the community that you were describing?
Most certainly. I'll expand on that. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm doing a very kind of considered and incremental approach to growing the board. There would be ways to grow the editorial team much faster, but I'm trying, to grow it in a way that I'm fully aware of everybody joining on board. But Collabra as a whole notion is very easy to integrate things into. I believe it would be entirely possible to run discrete meta-journals within the Collabra ecosystem. Because of a revenue sharing element there, you could say for a discrete ecosystem, say that everyone always pays forward and actually gets paid to the society that is behind that discrete meta-journal. So whole other concept, but yeah, Collabra is built to have people move to it wholesale, for sure. Watch this space.
It's a question for Anne. I usually publish with Cambridge Scholars Publishing, which actually allow you to maintain copyright. You don't have to pay anything. And Cosmos and History, which again allows you to maintain copyright. You don't have to pay anything. And about a few years ago, I was approached by an Elsevier journal to write a target article, and which was actually meant to be a journal special issue. And I said, fair enough. I knew the editor. And then I was told that to maintain copyright, I had to pay $1,800. Now, the editor actually sympathized with me on this. So the article is going to come out with Cambridge Scholars in February in a book from which I might make some money versus lose $1,800. So why should I ever submit to Elsevier?
Why should you? Okay. That's a great question. I mean, I think that the whole issue is tied up in copyright when essentially what we're talking about is perhaps publishing in an open access way with a Creative Commons license, as opposed to submitting to a subscription journal where it would be free. And the intent with this editor, I assume, is to have made this article open access using some form of Creative Commons, correct? And that would...
Actually, one thing I should say immediately, sorry, the mic is gone, is Cosmos and History allows total open access. So I would actually say Cosmos and History is Open Humanities Press, allows total open access. And with respect to the journal, which shall remain nameless because I don't want to get this guy in trouble. So with respect to this journal, it's not open access, and I simply wanted to maintain copyright of the material that I'd worked on for about a year. I think that's a fair aspiration.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think it allows, our copyright policies allow for distribution of the article itself as part of the broader database, but we're seeing a shift in these models as we do move to open access, and there are a variety of licenses that Elsevier now supports, including CC BY and CC BY-ND, which allows authors to have a choice. But normally that comes together with open access publishing, whereby once you own the copyright, then it can be distributed anywhere, which is essentially an open model. For our subscription titles, we still retain copyright. And there are two models to choose from.
I think other people have questions.
Hi, I'm Catherine Mitchell from the California Digital Library, and I have a question about the UC open access policy, which we're in the business of implementing. This is related to the question of what you just said, Anne, with regard to copyright. I'm here.
Thank you.
So it is the nature of the open access policies, all of them at UC, that there is a grant of license to the UC regions. And so the faculty, they make a prior grant by virtue of employment. So there is no exclusive ownership of copyright on behalf of, on the part of the publisher. That there is always a prior grant of license to the institution. And the notion is that this is a green OA model. This will be an archived version, even if the faculty don't publish in open access. It's tricky because we don't want to put the publisher version into the repository. We want to retain the publisher's right to make that version available on the publisher website. And so we need the author's final version to put into the repository per the policy requirements. Do any of you see a situation in which the publishers might be able to provide those authors' final versions to the institution or to a sort of centralized bank to enable the faculty to comply without having to act individually in each case?
I can say from Elsevier's point of view, we are in discussions with a number of libraries about auto deposit systems to take that pain away from the authors to know when they are complying. And so we're looking at automatic deposit of what we call the accepted manuscript, or the AAM, in order to streamline that process. But it's early days, and some of the details are being ironed out, but it's something that I'm sure that we would like to discuss with this institution.
Great, thank you.
I don't know. Anybody else that's similar?
Hi, Corey Snavely with
Sorry, hold on one second. I think Andrew was...
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, I think Jeff was looking at me.
Well, we have
to say,
another publisher up there, so.
But yes, I think all publishers, commercial publishers who have the scale, are really looking at ways to reduce the pain points. And we know institutionally for faculty that is a huge one. So as Anne said, it's kind of early days, but the discussions are definitely ongoing.
Okay. Yeah, this is Corey Snavely from Berkeley Lab and NERSC. And so thanks for the overview of exciting initiatives. I think there's a whole level of excitement that comes after that when we start to see interoperability among the different projects and services over the whole ecosystem. And critical to that is standardization of minimum standards for metadata. And so I just wanted to see if anyone on the stage or anyone in the room had any projects or initiatives that they'd like to mention around standardization of metadata for science data. Or if you want to spin that up into any kind of visionary response, feel free to do so.
I mean, we're sitting in a room where I can see about 5 or 6 people working on those things. So I honestly think if it was just me sitting here, I would just throw it out to anybody who would like to respond.
Does anyone here want to comment?
Yeah, so I'm gonna make one comment first. And so I'm with ORCID, the executive director of ORCID. Thanks, Josh, for speaking, because I can't very well today. So there's a lot of work on standardization of metadata, and I think one of the questions we have to ask is, does everyone have to have super deep metadata in every single repository, or do we really move to a model where there is a source for the information where any updates will be managed at the source, and we start using things like persistent identifiers to point to source documents. That's the approach that we've taken at ORCID, is trying to understand what is the minimal amount of metadata that needs to be packaged around an identifier as it travels through this interoperable ecosystem, and how do we make sure that these identifiers are persistent and resolvable, and at the source is where any changes or updates to that metadata is managed, rather than in every single repository that this thing might be put in. So that's the approach that we've taken.
Is there anyone else who wants to comment on that metadata issue before we move on?
Yeah, hi, I'm Eleonora Presani. I'm publisher at Elsevier. So Anna mentioned the micro articles that are like a kind of wraps around data or software and things like this. And for those articles, we have specific boxes for metadata. And we are working together with Force 11, for example, to try to find a unified way to define them so that they can be used for search. And that would be a search in Science Direct, but also on Google or any other search engine.
Can I say a word, Justin?
Sorry?
I just want to say a word on metadata. This is just a pessimistic word rather than about particular projects or standards, but I'm deeply worried about metadata for data. The question was originally about scientific data and for software. The metadata for textual objects is a hard problem, and it's consumed a lot of effort. But it's a fairly well-defined problem, or at least it has become so over the last 20 years. To a large extent, the metadata identify the object itself and give us information we need about the object. But the object itself, text, documents itself. You don't need, except possibly a language translation, you usually don't need something to explain the text to you. It explains itself. Data and software, that's not true. The metadata includes the documentation. And we are so far away from being able to standardize documentation of data sets or of software, of code. And yet without something to explain the data to us and something to explain the code to us, it's not really reusable. So open data, you can make the data sets available. That's wonderful. And that's, there are tools, Elsevier and the publishers, Wiley are making tools available to share the data sets and to give them persistent identifiers. But can you use somebody else's data for your scientific research if you don't understand what instruments were used to measure it, what the conditions were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And that's the real problem, I think, is that we are nowhere near standardizing the documentation of the data or the code. And without it, we're not going to be able to do much open science on data or code.
And I promise it's not just some kind of justification of my way of looking at things, but so I think it's important to plan these things not just in the infrastructure about metadata, but just realize that we might not know in advance all the ways which people will want to use everything. So I think scenario planning is super important. I think I didn't even talk about it. I had a section, but the valency of citation, being able to cite certain elements within articles, changing software, continuously updating software, whether you're citing it positively, negatively. I mean, I think it's best to always think in terms of also organizing the house, but to think in terms of, how might I imagine this could be used? Which is why I think, we shouldn't design any of these systems based on what we've got. I mean, it is super important for everything to become much more open, because the more open and interoperable everything is, then the more we're going to be able to ensure that we can future-proof scenarios.
We had one that was waiting over here for a while. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eric Hansa with Open Context, and we're an open data publisher, mainly for the field sciences and archaeology. So on the question about the data documentation and how do we describe data to make it intelligible by wider groups than just the original researcher, it's a really difficult problem. In our own experience, we've invested huge amounts of effort, and we would get data sets from some researchers that would have a 90-page PDF codebook that would describe why 14 is a sheep and that type of thing. And so that would be, it's a tremendous amount of work to decode all of this information, describe it. So that data curation side of things, which is required not just on the metadata, but to describe individual data sets themselves, is time-consuming, it's costly, and in the sort of general ecosystem now, where so much of library budgets are sort of captured by subscriptions, escalating costs, and whatnot, I wonder how the panel reacts to this notion that if we're moving into open science and open data, are we actually investing enough in this, or is this something where is this open washing, where you've sort of slap a CC license on a mess and expect that wonderful open science to happen?
I just want to add one more thing, coming back to your comment about text descriptions. I think one can say, if it's text, we can understand it. But looking at some of the work that's being done right now in research reproducibility, just because something's written down in a method section doesn't mean we actually can find the ingredients. I would say some of the same attention that we need to pay to describing how to reuse a data set also needs to be put into the textual description of how we understand articles too. So let's not forget that. When you have words, it doesn't mean we can understand what they are.
Yeah, thanks. I should have made that point myself. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Can I just respond to your question? We're hearing a lot of pain points about not all data is created equal. So I was recently at another institution and I was talking to their vice provost of research, and they said, we have no idea how long to even store some of this data. Some of it's useless, some of it's not good. So it's not only just about curation, it's about prioritization. And so what we're trying to do is to develop a number of trackers to see how often data is being used. And if it's not used at all, that...
Yeah, but I mean, there are other... This is the problem with metrics, right? Because metrics have to be... Sorry, metrics have to be contextualized, right? So if you're dealing with certain kinds of information, we deal a lot with archaeology, right? You can only dig a site once, then you destroy it. It's gone. There's no way of ever recreating and getting that data again. So although the number of people in the world who might be interested in, Sumerian cuneiform tablets, people that could read that are probably like 10. That's so the metrics associated with that are going to be zilch compared to something that would be like nanomaterials or whatever. So I mean,
but maybe that's valid, and I mean maybe the standards are different in that discipline, and I think that's one thing that's really important, that not one size fits all, and maybe the metrics for archaeology would be different, and that is designated as preservable and necessary. This came up in the conversation I'm referring to came up in the context of vast quantities of astronomical data that they don't know how much to preserve and house and things like that. So perhaps this calls for a different standard in your field, which is something that we need to understand.
I'd like to expand on that question a little bit because it raises some of the issues that came up during the panel. So for all of you, the question of open washing, but taking it in a slightly different direction maybe, is, a lot of what we talk about is sort of the idea of just making things open, as the question brought up is. You build it, they will come. You make it open, they will come. What other aspects, challenges do you see related to open access? Imagine tomorrow we waved a magic wand and all copyright law is gone. Sorry, Anne and Andrew, but imagine somehow everything was open tomorrow. Is that sufficient to solve the problems with open science, or what other challenges are there beyond simply accessibility that play into the question of open science and scholarship?
If I can immediately jump in, I think open context is a perfect example of if you had open access business models by design, like the value add of something like open context is so phenomenal, people would and should be prepared for the amount of work that it takes to do that which open context does, because it's clear what goes on. And these are the new values that I want publishers to explore adding to these systems. But right now, we're not dealing in open access models by design. We're dealing in open access models by necessity, which is what budget is left over from after the $20 billion publishing industry what's left over from that. So this open washing, the only way we can do that right now is doing these things on shoestrings. So I'm definitely looking forward to a world where such projects such as open context and other projects can be viably and properly kind of modeled and funded, because we can kind of break free some of the budgets and I'm not even trying to malign these things that things are locked up in, but they are quite locked up, right? So I'm just saying that there needs to be much more of a premium put on efficiency in the scholarly communication system, not margins.
I think there's a challenge here with the concept of open washing, which is if you get something that's just open, they just slap a license on it, it's useless. There's a challenge. It needs to be discoverable, it needs to be usable, and it needs to be useful. And you need to think about the skills that researchers are going to need in order to preserve the processes, document things, expose that information. You need to think about the library skills. I mean, historically, we've been dealing in libraries with actually a relatively static set of information, objects, and resources for a few hundred years. And it's kind of gone a bit crazy in the last 25 years. Everything is emerging, everything is evolving, everything is changing. And how about data librarianship? And should you have an information professional embedded in each research team to help make sure that this is documented properly, that what's exposed, what's made open is usable, and all of the bubble of information around that is kept and preserved and exposed. That's the challenge, is the investment in skills, in research teams, in libraries, in research organizations, and in anyone who wants to make use of that needs to be trained in what the data means and how to use it.
I wonder if Andrew and Anne might want to say something about some of the initiatives around accessibility and context and things that are going on in some of the publishing organizations.
Well, Justin, you painted an interesting vision with the whole open, no copyright world. I mean, I would say for us in the current world, the biggest challenge is around changing researcher behavior. Now, this is obviously a group that's very committed to open in all things, but I don't think that applies to researchers at large for a variety of reasons. If you looked across discipline communities, okay, life sciences, health sciences, there is the trend of openness. If you look at social sciences and humanities, there isn't. And again, that's for many different reasons. So we need to change the incentives. That means publishers changing incentives, government changing incentives. There needs to be a way to address some of their concerns around data and other forms of openness. So I think that for us is a big focus right now.
Right. And in terms of initiatives that we've had, I mean, we've been pursuing this holy grail of reproducibility for quite some time. And back in 2011, we actually had a grand challenge in my area of computer science to create reproducible articles, which resulted in the 10 most expensive articles ever produced, probably in the history of the world, which, you know, developed an authoring tool and a solution for authoring in a virtual environment, which allowed people to manipulate the code from within inside the article. But it was very language specific, and I was struck by the fact that there is not a uniform solution, and the researcher behavior, as you say, is very different, and also the willingness and need to be open. And we see a lot of, I don't know, evangelism coming, particularly from certain quarters of the physical sciences, whereas in health, there's an altruistic notion that everything should be open. But at the end of the day, the surgeons are too busy to care. And if you're working for, you know, the American Cardiology Association and performing surgeries, you just want to know that that journal's coming out and it's being done right. And they have a different series of processes in place. So we have to move at the pace of the community and to continue maintaining all these models in parallel, which is not without cost to the publishers. I mean, the argument can be made that we need to invest more in different things, and I think we're seeing a real sea change. And I am at Elsevier in particular seeing a hunger to move on to the next series of questions, which is really great. And the question is open science. I don't think I would have taken this role at Elsevier even 2 years ago because there wasn't enough to say. And there's lots more to say now. I see the industry moving in the right direction.
I should mention that I see a few other folks in the room who are part of the BIDS Open Science and Reproducibility group. We've done quite a bit of work at BIDS as well around the question of reproducibility, which could come up this afternoon as well. Did you want to say something, Jeff, about the role of the libraries in this context?
Sure. I guess to go back to your question, Justin, about, you know, so is just making everything open enough? No, obviously. And people have been talking about it. I think for science, I see it as sort of a layered problem. A certain amount of, let me use data because we've been talking about data, and that's a good object for this problem. A certain amount of data reuse is contemporaneous, more or less. It's people, either I'm reusing my data in my lab, and I want to be able to document it, I want my postdocs to document it well enough that my next postdocs can reuse it. Or I'm sharing it with collaborators at another university, and they're going to use it in their experiments you know, within a year or two. So a lot of the human capital is still there, and a lot of the context has not been lost. Nonetheless, there still has to be a certain amount of documentation and authentication and validation of the data. But it's not really a preservation problem. It's a short-term reuse problem. We need to get better at that to have open science and to have more sharing. And that's probably for most of it. most data probably won't have value more than 5 years after it's collected. We're collecting so much of it, and our tools are getting better, and we're asking different questions. We don't want to save most data forever, probably. An exception for the star maps, right? The universe isn't changing that fast, so we don't want to throw out all the astronomy data every 5 years. But most data we don't really probably want to keep, but some of it we do. And so there's another layer to the problem, and that's preservation. And we have no idea yet really how to select. The selection problem for records, for archives, is one that still is a serious challenge. We can't keep everything. It's very expensive to curate it. But we've developed practices and tools and methods, and we're getting better at it. The selection problem for which data sets are worth preserving, given that it's very costly to preserve it, because then you have to add a whole lot more metadata. You also have to then worry about storage formats. You have to worry about the physical storage and having to reproduce that because the physical bits rot. So it's very expensive to preserve, and we have to select, but we don't know how to do that. So there's staged problems that we have to get into. And these are the types of problems that libraries have worked with information objects for centuries. But there are a whole new set of information objects that we don't really have much experience with yet, and we've got to get a lot better at. Yeah.
Hey, I'm John Bohannon from Science. So I'm a reporter, and so I take people like me take the content of what you're all generating, both researchers and publishers. So consider the article the unit of selection here. And then people like me generate headlines, and then people learn about this stuff. And the problem that I face, and something that the fellow from Wiley mentioned, which is pretty exciting, is the idea of structuring the information around a journal. So you don't just get the metadata about an article from a journal and who wrote it and so forth, but every little piece of it is atomized and labeled. And it could do a surprising amount of good because, for example, one of the surprisingly common problems is to just make mistakes as reporters about what an article, what was done. We get statistical tests wrong. We report a study was done. We imply that a study was done on people when in fact it was done on mice. We report the results completely wrong. And the reason is because journalists generally are not very scientifically educated. And when they are, they're extremely lazy and time-pressed and underpaid. And so there's this bottleneck that has a huge, disproportionate effect on this whole endeavor, let's call it science, where the information pipeline going from essentially the researchers to the world, and increasingly the researchers are also finding about each other's work through us. It's not like everyone's reading the original papers. They're reading essentially headlines and summaries, and we're generating them. And something that would really help is a standard model of press release that essentially just automatically generates for a reporter the key details that that reporter would otherwise need to actually read the paper to find. And frankly, I've just given up on reporters. They're not going to be able to read papers and extract that themselves. Researchers can barely do that, generally. So it would be so great if everything were structured, and this is dream vision time, so that essentially a press release wouldn't just be this. Currently what it is, I can tell you, we all get them every day. It's just a little bit of blob of text written by some press officer, usually at a journal or a university, and it's their filtered version of an article. And they've got their own problems. And they're kind of guessing what a reporter needs. But they usually do a really bad job. Usually, I can tell you from years of doing this, you just have to go and read the paper. And I'm one of a tiny fraction of reporters who bother doing that or can do that. So what do you think it would take, realistically, to start to generate? You don't even have to, you can ignore all papers ever published. Let's just start with papers now into the future. To be able to get enough standardization so that essentially the key details, and you can leave that to our community to determine what we most need. I can tell you the statistics is the most important. Just getting the result right. What was the experiment and what is the actual result? What was the test? How many subjects? Were they human? And what would it take to generate that?
Can I just interject? I mean, this is a common problem that we have heard from quite a few journalists. And so we, and I don't know, maybe you've partnered with Sense About Science, an organization that's coming from the UK, but recently they've set up shop in America to work on just these issues about how to essentially work with journalists to interpret the statistics in articles to not only create a better narrative, but also move towards greater accuracy. But I appreciate what you want is more of a templated version coming directly from the publishers to do that for you. So a suggestion for me might be to take that back to our counterparts at Sense About Science and work on that as a project. I also think that we see an increasing need for publishers to get involved in issues related to science. So when the whole vaccine autism question comes up yet again, we'll get calls, you're a publisher, can't you do something? Well, as a publisher, we can't necessarily weigh in on that question. We have to let the science speak for itself. But there also might be ways to apply, big data and machine learning techniques to start counting the science and actually looking at what the broad base of research results say. And we can't form a judgment, but we can say, here's a count. And I think that might also help in communicating science to the public, kind of giving a snapshot or a state of play is a really interesting idea. So those are two suggestions from my side.
I'll just add that I think the role that the media and science journalists are playing is increasingly important to the validation and eventually the reproducibility question. And so this is the idea you've presented is great, and I want to take it back to our colleagues who are working on our platform to say, well, could we automate some sort of digest or summary, which wouldn't just be useful for the media, but for researchers, right? We already have, as you saw in the picture, sort of the key figures and little descriptions there, but should there be information on methodology, and then, as you said, subject type and everything. So I think it's a great idea. I don't quite know what it would take, but maybe it's not a big stretch.
You have to get all the authors to hand enter, so it's not going to happen, right?
Well, you do and you don't, because if you think about the possibility of text mining technologies now, you could have it so that you could have a corpus of data, just a huge amount of information that's text, it's statistical analyses, it's where the data sets are stored, it's all the different kinds of contribution that were made to the research. Because, let's face it, an article is just a snapshot taken through a window of a piece of work. If you can automate those processes, if you can start pulling all of those micro annotations, those tiny little bits of information out, then you can just tell the machine what information you're looking for. And you can start saying, okay, I need these 9 boxes filled with information about this article, or these articles, or this journal issue, or this whole debate going back through the literature. And you can add and enrich to that. I mean, that's not a million miles away from possible today. We're at the beginning of that road, and it's a very exciting journey. But it's about making sure everything is there, so getting rid of horrible, flat, locked-down PDFs that you have to boil the information out of it to use it. Things like that. These are technology changes that publishers are making. And the computing technology to do it is coming online. So it's going to happen.
Right, and I want to add one more thing is, we keep thinking about doing everything just at the time of publication, and there's so much work being done now in the area of e-lab notebooks and XML, all kinds of things that can really assist in this annotation pathway. So it isn't so much at the point of publication asking the author to check all these boxes and select from lists. It's really, how do we create an information flow that assists with annotation as we're doing the work, whether it's in archaeology, whether it's in my field in neuroscience, or something else, right? So how do we spread that work out to make it a lot easier for people to actually do this stuff? Because I'm with you. I mean, having worked in the lab, I don't want to sit there when I publish a paper and have to annotate down to the last little iota on it. I used a human between the age of 36 and 42 in the state of Maryland. Come on, but that should be part of what's in my lab notebook, right? So how do we bring that through and include it in the metadata about the articles, but the data set, et cetera? So that's what we need to start to think about. It's broader than just the actual, as Josh says, the snapshot in the point in time of you communicating a piece of what we're doing.
I think we have one last comment here, and then we will go to lunch.
Thank you. So just want to add that I think it's a brilliant suggestion, the idea of like facilitating press releases in a more structured way. I do think the problem is not a technical one. I think the problem is a social one. And it's a problem that should be addressed by the community, not necessarily by publishers. I believe that authors will be in a much better position to do their job by themselves, and I want to talk to you.
And if I could just make a quick gloss
please.
on that, and it relates to your earlier comment about reproducibility. One bit of hope here is that we, as a scientific community, are recognizing that we have not been really enabling people to reproduce our research. And partly it's because the expression of that research hasn't been very complete and hasn't been very clear. And so what may or may not be a cultural shift towards greater reproducibility will necessarily entail a more careful and systematic and structured expression of what we did in our research, which will help the journalists as well. And actually you might want to engage with and collaborate in that, because if the research is presented in a fashion that can be reproduced, that's going to require greater structure and greater transparency.
All right.
I was going to say, be a key driver. If a way to get authors to make their research or present their research in a way that is more reproducible, but it also makes their research more likely to be picked up by a journalist because they can see all the requisite parts, then it might be a parallel driver to improved open science practices that are beyond compliance, that it's about just let's do this because it's a better practice, not because a journal told me to.
Okay, on that very compelling note, the first rule of moderation is not to stand between you and lunch. So thank you all very much for coming, for the interesting discussion. Thank our panelists.